Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
Fanny stood on the platform and looked at Harry. He was hard to see in the bright light from the furnace. She felt strange inside, like she was taking a drug. His face was lit by the fire, but he did not notice her. He wore a common cap and a scarf around his neck. Fanny opened the door of her train and took out her bags. Harry was at the edge of the crowd, missing her. She called, "Harry," and waved her umbrella. He smiled and came closer. "You've come," he said happily. She felt nervous and kissed him quickly. "2 suitcases," she told him. Harry climbed into the train to get her bags. Fanny felt sad. She had returned home for good. She looked nice in her coat and hat, while Harry struggled with her bags. "There's a trunk at the back," she said. But she didn't feel happy. The foundry's tall chimneys were glowing in the night sky. Everything felt familiar and strange at the same time. Fanny was a lady's maid, 30 years old, and had come back to marry Harry, her first love, after many years. She did not truly love him. She loved someone else who had hurt her. Now she was back to marry Harry, who had waited for her. "Can't a porter carry those?" she asked as Harry walked down the platform. "I can manage," he replied. They found her trunk. "We'll get a cart to bring it," he said. "Isn't there a cab?" she asked, knowing there wasn't one. Harry put the trunk down carefully and went back for her bags. They began to walk up the hill near the foundry. Fanny felt sad as she walked beside him. The noise from the foundry was loud and awful. Fanny remembered arriving at Gloucester in a nice carriage and driving past trees with her cousin. Now she felt different and unhappy as she walked up the hill beside Harry. He stopped to rest and put the bags down. They stood under a lamppost. People passed by and smiled at Harry, but they did not recognize Fanny. She felt like a stranger. "They're too heavy for you." "Let me carry one," Fanny said. "They feel heavy after a mile," he replied. "Let me carry the small one," she insisted. "Okay, you can have it for a minute," he said, giving her the bag. They walked through the little town with shops on the hill. Everyone stared at her. People were going to the cinema, and there were long lines outside. "Good night, Harry," some guys called out. Finally, they reached her aunt's sweet shop. They rang the doorbell, and her aunt came out of the kitchen. "There you are, dear. You must want tea." "How are you?" her aunt said, giving her a kiss. Fanny felt like crying. Maybe she just wanted tea. "You've carried a lot of luggage," her aunt told Harry. "Yes, I'm glad to put it down," he said, looking at his sore hand. Harry left to get a cart for the trunk. Fanny sat down for tea. Her aunt, a kind little woman with gray hair, looked at Fanny and felt sad for her. Fanny was beautiful and tall with nice features, but she often felt disappointment. "So you really came back?" her aunt asked. "Yes, Aunt," Fanny replied. "Per Harry. I hope you're not taking advantage of him." "Oh, Aunt, he has waited so long. He should get what he waited for," Fanny said with a sad laugh. "He's waited so long. It might be hard for him," her aunt said. "I like him, but I'm not sure he's good enough for you. Harry is common, but he's not humble." "He thinks he's good enough," Fanny replied. It's good if he believes in himself, her aunt said. He has good points, Fanny said. Yes, he's nice, but he's not good enough for you, her aunt said. I've made my decision, Aunt, Fanny said firmly. Good things come to those who wait, her aunt replied. More than he expected, right, Aunt? Fanny laughed bitterly. This made her aunt sad for Fanny. They were interrupted by the shop bell ringing and Harry's voice saying, right? When he didn't come in, Fanny went to check on him. As she stood in the doorway, she heard a loud woman shouting from across the street, "Are you there?" "I'll shame you." Fanny was surprised and looked across the dark street. She saw a woman in a black hat go under a streetlight. Harry and Bill brought the trunk up to the shop. "Where should we put it?" asked Harry. "Let's take it upstairs," said Fanny. She went up first to turn on the gas light. After they brought in the trunk, Harry sat down to eat tea and pork pie. Fanny asked, "Who was that woman shouting?" "I don't know. Maybe she was shouting at someone," Harry said. Fanny looked at him but didn't ask more. Harry was a 32-year-old man with light hair and a mustache. He looked like a worker, and women liked him because he was warm and kind. But Fanny felt frustrated because he had no dreams or goals. He worked at the foundry but didn't save any money. Fanny knew she would have to provide for them. He didn't care much about anything. She felt he was a burden to her. He stayed until about 9:30. Fanny walked him to the door. "When are you coming up?" he asked. "I'll come tomorrow afternoon," she said. Fanny didn't like his mother, Mrs. Goodall. After Harry left, Fanny's aunt said, "It's your fault if he doesn't seem eager." "Oh, Aunt, I couldn't stand him if he were too eager." "I prefer him this way," Fanny replied. The two women talked late into the night. They understood each other. Fanny's aunt had married a man who wasn't a good match for her, too. The next day, Fanny visited Harry's family. Mrs. Goodall was a large woman with common ways. She had spoiled her children and didn't like fancy talk. "I'm not as nice as I look," Mrs. Goodall said to Fanny. "I told him to wait, but he didn't listen," she continued. Mrs. Goodall was angry, but also proud that Fanny was with Harry. Everyone knew Fanny had money from her aunt. When Harry came home, they had tea together, and his sister Ginny said rude things. Fanny was invited to tea again on Sunday, and they talked about the wedding. It would be in 2 weeks at Morley Chapel, where Fanny and Harry first met. Harry was still in the chapel choir because he liked to sing, even though he didn't do it very often. It was a shame, but nothing could change it. Harry had a good voice, but he sang funny because of his words. He only sang at cheap concerts and little chapels, and people laughed at him. It was now September, and Sunday was the Harvest Festival at Morley Chapel. Harry was singing solos, and Fanny planned to go to the service and have tea with him afterward. 10 years ago, she had enjoyed a Sunday service at Morley Chapel with her cousin Luther. She remembered how Harry sang then, wearing a pale blue tie. Once again, it was Harvest Festival, and the day was beautiful. The chapel was decorated with corn, grapes, and flowers. The air was warm and crowded. The Reverend Enderby greeted Fanny before he went up to speak. Fanny looked beautiful in her nice dress and hat. She sat in the side aisle, and Harry was in the gallery above. She could only see part of his face. He had a charming look, but she felt unhappy because of him. Come, ye thankful people, come. The hymn felt wrong because the weather had been bad and many crops were still in the fields. Fanny sang little but looked lovely. Harry sang well in his dark suit, and Fanny felt angry and sad. She hated how he attracted her but couldn't help it. He was the first man to kiss her, and those memories stayed with her. She knew returning to him would make her life hard, but she felt trapped. He had to sing 2 solos that afternoon, and Fanny wondered how he wasn't shy. He looked confident as he sang, and she felt both rage and desire for him. Harry sang with passion, and Fanny felt a mix of attraction and disgust. She knew he would pull her back into a common life, which she didn't want. The second song was an anthem with beautiful words. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. The altos and trebles joined in, making the song lovely. Yes, it was moving. Just as Harry was finishing his song, a loud woman shouted from the crowd. The organ stopped, and everyone looked surprised. "You look good singing here, Harry Goodall," she yelled. "But you're a bad man. You brought your girlfriend here. Everyone should know you're a scamp." She pointed at Fanny. Fanny was shocked and turned pale, then bright red. She recognized the woman, Mrs. Nixon, who was known for being tough and mean. Fanny sat still, frozen in her seat. The chapel was silent. The audience was shocked, and Harry stood there with a blank look, not caring about the woman's words. Mrs. Nixon sat defiantly, ready for trouble. Then the tall minister stood up. He spoke in a strong, sad voice. "Let's sing the last hymn." The organ played, and the offering was taken during the hymn. Afterward, the minister prayed, asking God to help them. Fanny watched Harry, who was also leaning forward. She felt angry and confused. People began to leave the chapel, looking at Fanny, Mrs. Nixon, and Harry. Mrs. Nixon stood her ground, while Fanny stayed still. Harry left the gallery, looking embarrassed. The minister sat quietly while everyone left. After a while, he came down and closed the door, then sat next to Fanny. "This is very unfortunate," he said sadly. "I'm so sorry." "It was a big surprise," Fanny replied. "Yes, a surprise," he agreed. "I don't know that woman." "I do," said Fanny. "She's bad." "I don't understand," the minister said, shaking his head. "It's regrettable." "I'm very sorry." Fanny watched the vestry door, knowing the choir was curious about what happened. Finally, Harry came in, looking shy. "Well," said Fanny. "We had an extra problem," Harry said. "Yes, I can see that," Fanny replied. "It's very unfortunate." "Do you understand?" asked the minister. "I know. The girl is having a baby and she blames me," Harry explained. "Does she have reason to?" Fanny asked, upset. "It's not mine," Harry said, looking away. "Which girl?" Fanny wanted to know. "Annie, the young one," he replied. "I don't know them," said the minister. "You wouldn't. Their name's Nixon. The mother is mean and makes her daughter bad. They live in Manners Road," Fanny said. "Is something wrong with her?" Fanny asked. "She was fine before." "Yes, but she's always going out with bad boys," Harry said. "How awful." Fanny replied. Harry wanted to leave, glancing at the door. It's very distressing, the minister said, shaking his head. Will you want me tonight, Mr. Enderby? Harry asked quietly. Yes, we should ignore this and not make a big deal, the minister said. Fanny hesitated and asked Harry, Will you come? Yes, I'll come, he said. Good afternoon, Mr. Enderby, Harry said. Good afternoon, Harry, the minister replied. Fanny followed Harry out, and they walked in silence. It's not just your fault, Fanny said. Yes, Harry answered shortly. They walked in silence until they reached Harry Street. Fanny thought about going to her aunt's, but decided to follow Harry home. When they entered, Harry's family was there. You've been in trouble, Mrs. Goodall said. Who told you? Harry asked. Maggie and Luke were here, she replied. You look good, Ginny teased. Harry hung up his hat without responding. Come upstairs and take your hat off, Mrs. Goodall said to Fanny kindly. She didn't want Fanny to leave Harry now. What did she say? Asked Harry's father quietly, pointing to the stairs where Fanny had gone. Nothing yet, Harry replied. You deserve it if she leaves you now, Ginny said. I bet it's true about you and Annie Nixon. You bet too much, Harry said. But you can't deny it, Ginny replied. I can if I want. His father looked at him curiously. It's not my child, just like it's not Bill Bowers or Ted Slaney's, Harry told his father. His father nodded. That won't help you in court, Ginny said. Upstairs, Fanny avoided her mother's questions and didn't say much. She fixed her hair, washed her hands, and put on a little powder for freshness, while Mrs. Goodall watched with disapproval. At Sunday tea, they had sardines, tinned salmon, tinned peaches, tarts, and cakes. The talk was about the Nixon family and the scandal. She's a foul-mouthed woman, Ginny said about Mrs. Nixon. She only came to church to shout. She was mean to Bob's kids. Once, when I was little, Gary ran away from her and hid all night. Fred Kautz threatened to hurt her if she touched the kids again, said the father. They scared her, Ginny said. But she was just as bad with her own kids. Bob's soft as mush now, Jack Goodall said. He'd lose his wages if the other men didn't help him. If he didn't bring her his wages, she'd be furious, Ginny added. She's clean and respectable, except for her foul mouth, Mrs. Goodall said. She keeps to herself and doesn't let anyone near. I wonder where Bob gets money for his drinks, Ginny said. Other men buy him drinks, Harry replied. He has the scariest rabbit eyes, Ginny said. Yeah, like a drunk man, Mrs. Goodall added. They kept talking after tea until it was almost time to go back to chapel. You need to get ready, Fanny, said Mrs. Goodall. I'm not going tonight, Fanny said suddenly. Everyone stopped. I'll stay with you tonight, Mother, she added. Good idea, my girl, said Mrs. Goodall, pleased.